Today, I want to speak carefully. I begin with a bias. I do not try to hide it. I'm wary of war. I'm especially wary of wars that might have been prevented through patience, diplomacy, or disciplined statecraft. War should be the last resort of a republic, not the first reflex. That bias does not make me naive about evil nor indifferent to threats. It simply means that once military force is unleashed, consequences multiply in ways no one fully controls. And with that in mind, I want to reflect on President Trump's recent military strikes on Iran and the arguments being raised in opposition. This is not exactly a partisan rant. It is an institutional and prudent concern because this is Wednesday and this is America. Even though it's Sunday, we vote on Tuesday and the rest of the days are Wednesday. Personal concerns about leadership in wartime. And before addressing constitutional or legal questions, I need to acknowledge something personal. When evaluating any president's decision to use force, character and leadership patterns matter. Wartime leadership requires disciplined consultation, sustained analysis, and temperament that absorbs complexity rather than reacting to it. My reaction about this president entering into a new military conflict stems from several observable patterns: a reluctancy to consistently solicit and integrate diverse counsel, a tendency to privilege instinct over structured critical analysis, a foreign policy record that has sometimes appeared closely intertwined with personal or political advantage, and a pattern of abrupt, improvisational decision making. In domestic policy, such traits create turbulence. In war, they can create tragedy. Now to the constitutional question. Article 1 of the United States Constitution grants Congress the authority to declare war. Over decades, presidents of both parties have expanded executive war-making authority through limited strikes, authorizations, and emergency powers, and the concern raised by critics is straightforward, and I share it. Significant military action against a sovereign nation should require advance congressional authorization. This issue is not simply this strike, it is precedent. When executive authority expands in matters of war, the balance between Article 1 and Article 2 shifts, often permanently. The founders did not make war easy, they made it deliberative. I'd like to turn to intelligence and imminence. The administration has framed the strikes as necessary to counter imminent threats. Critics argue that publicly available intelligence assessments do not demonstrate that immediacy. If Iran's capabilities were years away from directly threatening the United States homeland, then the legal and moral threshold for preventive force becomes far more ambiguous. History teaches us that intelligence can be incomplete, overstated, or selectively interpreted. The republic must demand clarity when the justification is urgency. If the threat was real and immediate, that should be demonstrated transparently. If it was not, then the case for force weakens significantly. I'd like to turn to the risk of escalation. Military planners often describe strikes as limited or surgical, but geopolitics rarely stays limited. Iran possesses asymmetric capabilities: proxy, militias, cyber capacity, regional influence. Retaliation may not look like conventional war, but it can widen instability across the region. What begins as a tactical strike can evolve into sustained engagement. Americans across the political spectrum have grown weary of prolonged foreign conflicts. That includes Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam. The question is not simply can we strike, but what follows? Perhaps more importantly, are we prepared for what follows? I turn to strategic effectiveness. Some analysts argue that air power alone rarely achieves political transformation. Even if you assassinate an 86-year-old leader, if the implicit goal is regime change, history suggests that bombing campaigns harden internal resolve rather than dissolve it. External force can consolidate domestic nationalism. Imagine the rallying cries of support for an administration we may strongly disagree with if a foreign power were to exercise its resolve to change our regime from the outside. If the goal is deterrence, also, deterrence requires clarity of red lines and proportionality. If the goal is containment, that typically involves sustained diplomatic architecture. Military action without a coherent articulated end state invites drift, and drift in war is costly. Then there are international law considerations. Under the UN Charter, force is generally justified in cases of self-defense against an imminent armed attack or with Security Council authorization. Legal scholars have questioned whether the threshold of lawful self-defense was met here. One can debate the adequacy of international law, but if the United States appears to disregard those norms, we weaken our ability to invoke them when our own security is threatened. Law, even imperfect law, functions as a stabilizing structure in international relations. Now take the America First and policy consistency statement. Some of the sharpest criticism has come from traditional opponents, not, but from within the president's broader coalition. I do not identify with the America First coalition, but the America First message emphasized restraint in foreign entanglements and a pivot toward domestic renewal. Escalating military involvement in the Middle East appears to some as a departure from that principle. Consistency matters in foreign policy. Allies and adversaries alike watch for coherence between rhetoric and action. And then we ask, is this a self-generated crisis? Another argument advanced by critics is that the current confrontation is partially the result of earlier diplomatic withdrawals, when negotiated agreements are abandoned without replacement frameworks. The diplomatic pressure valve disappears. If diplomatic channels were available and used, then escalation becomes, at least in part, self-generated. This does not absolve Iran of responsibility for its actions, but it complicates the narrative of inevitability. So where does this leave us? There are serious people who support these strikes. They argue deterrence was necessary. They argue strength prevents greater conflict. Those arguments deserve engagement. But a republic must ask disciplined questions before normalizing unilateral war. Is the constitutional process being honored? Is the intelligence sound and transparent? Is there a defined strategic objective? Are we prepared for escalation? And is this aligned with our stated reflections and principles and biases toward peace? I return to where I began. I'm wary of war. I'm against it, especially preventable war. Strength is not diminished by deliberation. In fact, disciplined deliberation is one of the strengths of constitutional government. The real question before us is not whether America has power. America does have power. The question is whether we are using that power in a way that preserves both our security and our constitutional order. That conversation must continue, not only on Tuesday during elections, but every Wednesday thereafter. This is Wednesday in America. I'm Tom Sims.